I botched a $30,000 stem cell procedure doing something that felt completely harmless. It didn't hurt and I had no warning. This story exposes a risk inherent in post-procedure recovery following orthopedic stem cell treatment. It's one I have not seen meaningfully addressed by physicians, either in my own treatment or more broadly. This is the background. In late 2018, I underwent a massive orthopedic stem cell procedure in the Cayman Islands to treat whole body osteoarthritis. Nearly every peripheral joint in my body was treated, as was my lumbar spine. This was my second stem cell procedure. I'd had my first one about 2 years earlier, and during my recovery from the first treatment, I learned something about how fragile the outcome could be. Going into my first procedure, I assumed post-procedure joint protection would be critical, but the rehab protocols from the clinic didn't emphasize that. They only said to let pain be your guide to activity, and they said you could return to aggressive activity like sports 6 weeks out. So 6 weeks to the day from the procedure, I went back to the gym, loaded up the leg press with hundreds of pounds, and went for it. That turned out to be a very bad idea. It didn't hurt while I was doing it, but afterward I realized it had caused a clear setback, and it undid some of the improvement I had seen to that point. That was the first time I had direct proof that heavy loading during recovery could undo improvement, even if it didn't hurt in the moment. I still got a good overall result from that procedure, in fact a life-changing one because of the improvement in my neck and some other key areas, but I always bitterly regretted that incident with the leg press because I believed the outcome could have been even better had I not made that mistake. I didn't get good results in my feet. My right hip and knee did improve, but probably not as much as they would have otherwise. So going into my second procedure, I was keenly aware of the need to protect the joints during recovery. I was determined to be a lot more conservative in my return to activity this time. I was even trying to redeem myself after that first one because I blamed myself for partially botching it. I deeply trusted the clinic for their procedures, but I wasn't buying this idea that doing sports 6 weeks out was a good idea. So I was going on my own on that part. Over the first few weeks after the procedure, the results came on quickly. I could feel definite positive changes in most of the joints. In particular, the movement in the joints became noticeably smoother. So it wasn't just pain relief, it was a mechanical difference, and I attributed that to cartilage regeneration. That effect was especially pronounced in the joints of my fingers. For the first part of the recovery, everything went according to plan. I avoided heavy lifting and exposed my joints to appropriate loading through everyday activity and walking. I planned to re-enter the gym at the 10-week mark and progress gradually. This time I planned to give myself much more time to recover before hitting heavy weights than after my first procedure. But 10 weeks to the day from the treatment, I got a text message from an old friend inviting me to his birthday party that evening. Okay, cool. So I met the group at a restaurant. And while we were there, they mentioned they were going bowling at a place across the street afterward, and they invited me to join them. At that moment, an alarm went off. Bowling was definitely not in my recovery plan at that point. I was afraid it might put too much strain on my finger joints, but I felt pressure to go along. This was an old friend I didn't see very much anymore, and I just didn't want to say no. So I stayed indecisive throughout the rest of the dinner. I didn't really think bowling would hurt me, but I was very uneasy about it because on some level, I recognized what was at stake. I had organized my life around saving for these procedures. When it was time to leave, they asked if I was joining them, and I didn't want to because I didn't want to compromise my outcome, but I decided to tag along anyway and judge it by feel once I got there. At that point, I wasn't deciding to bowl, I was deciding not to decide yet. Walking out of the restaurant toward the bowling alley, I remember thinking this was my chance to back out, and I had an ominous sense that if I didn't, I would remember that exact moment later and regret it. But I went along anyway. When we got to the bowling alley, I realized the activity they had planned for the evening wasn't even standard bowling, but what's called duck pin bowling, which is like miniature bowling with a little 3.5-pound ball. When I held the ball in my hand, it felt so light I barely even noticed I was holding it. It just fit right in my palm, and I didn't have to strain my fingers to grip it. And as soon as I felt it, my concern instantly evaporated. I thought, of course I can handle this. At the time, I was still in good shape, so 3.5 pounds wasn't enough to even begin to get my attention. So I took a few throws of the ball and felt no pain or strain whatsoever. Now again, the clinic's recovery guidelines said to let pain be your primary guide to activity. They said an activity was acceptable as long as it didn't provoke pain above level 2 on a scale of 10, either before or after the activity. And 10 weeks out, those same protocols also sanctioned a return to full activity as tolerated. I don't remember consciously weighing those guidelines as I made the decision to bowl, but nothing in them told me not to do it. I already knew from prior experience that an activity doesn't have to hurt to cause damage during recovery, but the bowling felt truly harmless. It felt so easy, it didn't even register as a threat. It just felt like ordinary daily activity, so I went ahead. That night, I bowled the ball 60 times over about 2 hours. Each time, I lifted the ball from the ball return using a wide grip, clamping it with my fingertips. I casually tossed it back and forth between my hands, just playing with it for a minute. When I was ready to bowl, I took a big initial step forward and swung my arm back like a pendulum with the ball suspended at the end of my fully extended arm. Then I planted hard on my left leg and bent forward at the waist, throwing my lumbar and thoracic spine into deep flexion and my neck into sudden extension, and swung my arm forward rapidly to accelerate the ball. And as it left my hand, that force transmitted through my finger joints. Now, it was only 3.5 pounds, but it was 3.5 pounds at the end of a long lever arm moving fast. And I did that 60 times. I felt almost no pain while I was doing it. Toward the very end, I remember feeling some mild burning in my feet and also some in my sternal joints, but it was nothing concerning. My feet just felt like they normally would if I had been standing too long. And at the end of the night, I had absolutely no indication that anything was wrong. But the next day, while I was at work, I noticed something was wrong. My typing precision was off, and I was missing keystrokes. I realized the movement in my finger joints was suddenly much stiffer than I was used to, and it disrupted the timing of my finger movements. So I did what I often do to assess the joint surfaces. I spread my fingers and made small, controlled movements, feeling for friction. What I felt was alarming. The friction in my finger joints had increased drastically overnight, and it was now much worse than it had ever been. The grinding in my finger joints was suddenly much rougher, and there was much more resistance to movement. And I knew that meant surface damage. The smoother joint movement I felt after the stem cell treatment was suddenly gone. It was replaced with mechanical evidence of new damage. The timing of this was unmistakable. I didn't want to believe it, but the correlation was too obvious to ignore. As that day went on, I experienced a massive whole body flare-up, like the likes of which I hadn't had in years. And over the following days, I noticed the same signs of joint damage in the other joints in my upper extremities. They just fell like dominoes. I knew I had screwed up badly, but I somehow held out hope that the damage wouldn't be permanent and some benefit of the procedure would survive. At that point, the joints in my lower body still seemed spared, at least. So I decided to delay my return to the gym to give myself more time to recover. But as time passed, I didn't get better. And when I finally reintroduced hard exercise 5 months out, all hell broke loose in my body. Whatever remaining improvement I had broke down rapidly, and my pain level shot up to a level far worse than before the procedure. And as my joint symptoms got worse, a particular pattern emerged that exactly matched the mechanics of bowling. The joints in my right arm, my bowling arm, were damaged far worse than the joints of my left arm, and my left hip and knee, the joints of the leg I planted on during bowling, were damaged far worse than the same joints on my right side. There was also a marked increase in pain throughout my spine, which is heavily involved in bowling. I already knew the bowling caused the damage, so that pattern didn't tell me anything I didn't already know, but it made the cause undeniable. There was no pain, no warning, no signal from my body that would have told me to stop. I judged it as safe because it felt easy and below the threshold that I thought would have caused damage. So I went ahead. That single mistake completely destroyed my stem cell procedure and caused fresh new joint damage everywhere. So that's the story of how a mistake I couldn't even feel destroyed my stem cell procedure. During recovery, the line between safe and harmful activity was invisible. I crossed it without realizing it and only found out once the damage was done. I hope this draws attention to an underappreciated risk in orthopedic stem cell treatment recovery, and if it helps other patients avoid the same mistakes, it might improve their outcomes.